So, in my first video, I went over how I thought Philosophy Tube was wrong about how he related absurdism with Rick and Morty. And I think I was wrong-headed in that video. For the most part, other than the distinction between existentialism and absurdism, I don't think you can understand the ideas of Camus any better with my video, so it's kind of a failure. Since that's the case, I thought I'd do a primer video on Camus, an overview of his work, specifically the myth of Sisyphus. First of all, Camus' philosophy as formulated in the myth of Sisyphus is based on a lot of imagery and very little metaphysics. He flat out says this in the beginning, and the condition he refers to in the essay as the absurd is taken as a given. Camus describes absurdism as the divorce between the meanings that an individual comes up with and the world's meanings, which is completely disconnected. Most people hold that Camus envisioned the world to have no meaning. I kind of disagree. I think absurdism works just fine as long as there's that disconnect, a fundamental uncertainty that the meaning you think life has is in any way related to the world's. Either way, it's kind of a moot point. The myth of Sisyphus functions the same, so disregard the personal note. Anyway, Camus starts off his famous essay not with the famous statement, "There is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide." That's actually the start of the second segment of the first chapter, an absurd reason. Don't fall into the trap! Now the essay proper starts off with the mission statement and then goes into the phenomenon of suicide, and Camus tries to find the common thread. He says that the people he looked at had very different reasons for doing what they did, but he thought that the real issue was that they were exposed to the absurd and he couldn't ignore it anymore. He particularly points to cases of trauma like the death of a child and explains how the people who experienced them didn't typically commit suicide when the trauma was fresh, but later in life. He says that points to the fact that it wasn't the trauma that really drove these people to commit suicide, it was the absurd. Now you've probably heard the three classic responses that Camus had for the condition he referred to as the absurd. He said you can commit suicide physically, you can commit suicide philosophically, or the last and recommended response, to live without appeal and accept the absurd. And we've talked about the physical suicide, but the philosophical suicide is more. Just more. Camus actually explains how something is absurd here. He uses the example of a virtuous man being called a philanderer. He says that the man would reply that this is absurd because it's a contradiction. He uses the term philosophical suicide to refer to things like existentialism and Kierkegaard's leap of faith. I won't go into too much detail, but for Camus, Kierkegaard saw the absurd, and his leap of faith is the idea that in the face of it, you have to take a leap of faith into the religious realm, a transcendent realm. That doesn't have to make sense to you, or be proven. For Camus, this has two issues. For one, this doesn't escape the uncertainty, you're effectively just ignoring the absurd. The second, he thought that since this wasn't really reasoning, it was an appeal to something outside of reason, and he wanted to know if you could function without that. He didn't want to bend the knee of reason. On his critiques of other existentialists, Camus is a tad hard to explain. The simplest way I can say for Chestov, he thought that he looked for something beyond reason and that was an escape like Kierkegaard's. He says that he focuses too much on attacking reason and sort of dodges absurdism, because absurdism only works if there is that tension between the world's reason and our reason. If you negate reason altogether, then it's not really an issue. And now finally we approach acceptance. Approach. Because first we have to go through the implications of what Camus calls life without appeal. He thought that the best way to live was to live without assuming anything, without making a leap of faith, without negating his own reason, and he thought that this had very peculiar implications. For one, he thought that this meant there was no way to experience life in a better way. He compares a conqueror to a post office subclerk and says that really, they both experience life on the same level, as long as they are aware of the absurd. He thought that the only prescription on how to live was to maximize the quantity of your experiences within the realm of the absurd. So long as the post office sub-clerk is more aware of the absurd for more of their life, then they're doing it better than Genghis Khan. He actually goes in deep with how Don Juan was right to just collect romantic experiences, which is weird. Follow Contra. He also venerates the life of actors and writers. He says that they embody the man divorced from his settings, and they just sort of compile experiences of life in the absurd. Camus actually personally didn't like being called a philosopher. He preferred the titles of playwright or novelist. He actually talks about actors in a very loving and affectionate way, which is, it's adorable. He does say that a big issue with creating is that there is a natural pull to escape and deny the absurd, and it's really strong. But for the sake of your own intellectual integrity, you have to keep staring at it and never ignore it. Now, finally, acceptance. If you accept the absurd nature of the world, you are revolting against your tortures and you win.